I just watched Kung Fu Panda for the first time, and it was a pretty good movie. It was fine. The choreography was really cool, which is probably what most people say with regards to this movie. I don't watch that much conversation about Kung Fu Panda. However, I do hear things here and there. And one thing I heard was conversation with regards to Tai Lung's relationship with Master Shifu. Basically, that it was Shifu's fault explicitly that Tai Lung turned out the way that he did. He, filled his head with these expectations of becoming the Dragon Warrior, even though that wasn't his destiny. It wasn't his decision to make. So, people felt sort of bad for Tai Lung, but, he's the villain. The villain's gonna villain, basically. Even though Shifu filled his head with these false promises. He is an adult with his own agency, and he, had that decision that he could make himself, and he turned out to, go on a path of destruction. That's fine. I tend to agree when people say that Shifu has some sort of, some level of responsibility for that. That's cool. Here's what I'm going to say about the movie. I really like Shifu's role in it because he's a big part of Po's life in that journey of becoming the Dragon Warrior. And he's a big part of Tai Lung's life. Obviously, he adopted him and, raised him from a child. And, it's really sort of powerful seeing that sort of molding of a human being and their ideology. Shifu was a very impatient person, and that was very well illustrated throughout the movie. And that was contrasted with Master Uwe. He was very go with the flow. You can't predict the direction of the waves kind of person. And that was, by the text of the movie, the correct ideology to sort of embody. I feel like Po should have had his father embody that ideology a little bit more to contrast Shifu. Because it would be a nice little foil for Shifu and Tai Lung over here on this side, being like, we're going to have this idea of rigidity, and something will happen if we will it with enough force, even though we can't control all these other outside factors of the world and the entropy of the universe. And then we could contrast that with one little change that I feel like the movie could have made to make it so much more thematically resonant and so much more powerful for Po in particular. I feel like Po's dad should have been more supportive of the fact that Po wanted to be a martial artist. In the beginning of the movie, Po's very much like, I have to hide my aspirations from my dad because my dad's going to be like, but you have to take over the shop. Well, come on. Why not just have Po's dad be like, okay, well, it's not necessarily what I wanted for you, but, you are your own person. You have this thing that you really want to do. I'm going to allow you to do it, but if you're going to do it well. Do it with your full intentionality. I just watched, this is like one video about like Matthew McConaughey talking to his dad, talking about how he wanted to become an actor. There was a moment where, Matthew McConaughey didn't know what kind of reaction his dad would have. And then his dad was just like, all right, cool. You know what? I'm going to let you do this, but don't half-ass it. And I feel like that's what Po's relationship with his dad should have been. That sort of letting the child choose their own way as opposed to enforcing your own will upon him. And putting a square peg in a round hole. And that is where Shifu kind of messed up. There was that moment, the climax of the movie, when Poe and Tai Lung are fighting. And what happens is Tai Lung gets a look at the dragon scroll, and he sees that it's a empty scroll. And he's like, what's going on here? He's like absolutely dumbfounded and confounded by like what this is. He's like, this is just a load of crap. And Poe, because of his father, is like, don't you get it? That's the whole point. The secret ingredient is that there's no ingredient. This is something that Poe's father said to him earlier in the movie. And it was a little bit ham-fisted. It just got, sort of injected in there, this idea. Like it was set up in the beginning of the movie, and like what's the secret ingredient for like the secret ingredient soup. But like how it was paid off in the movie was just like, there's like all this pandemonium going off. And then Poe's dad is like, oh, by the way, the secret ingredient too. The secret ingredient is, yeah, there's nothing. All right, bye. That's the key. And then Poe's like, wow, that's it. This relates to this internal struggle that I have going on right now. It just seemed a little ham-fisted. I just feel like if we had that sort of wave of Poe's dad being like, geez, you can do whatever you want, kid, and I'm behind you. As opposed to being like, I really want you to do what I do. I want you to carry on the family business. I get that there's like supposed to be that overlap of Poe's dad and Shifu, but I feel like it just would have been a stronger narrative if Poe had that, parental support for his own aspirations from the get-go, and the sort of struggle that Poe was going through at the beginning of the movie was that he was a bad martial artist. I feel like that's a strong enough struggle for the protagonist for that beginning part of the movie. He doesn't need that struggle with his father to add on, because it really didn't go anywhere, honestly. So yeah, that's what I feel.